Hey guys, Josh here, talking a little about Zoom and what we can see with wire data and ExtraHop, and kind of some of the things that have been floating out there. We've seen a lot with Zoom with everyone working from home, some of the security issues, some of the things, the best practices you can do to keep yourself secure on Zoom. So I just want to briefly kind of touch on some of those things. So there's a really good blog that I'm going to post to that Rapid7 did that walks through some of this. I'm not going to go through every one of these things, but there is a whole thing on linking data to Facebook that you can read about. The end-to-end encryption part is interesting. That's something that I can show you in ExtraHop, and they're doing it in an interesting way. But if you read a little about this, they're also using 128-bit encryption, which isn't the end of the world for like happy hours, regular meetings. It's potentially, brute forceable, right? You want to be able to get that up to 256. It's not the end of the world. And they aren't doing true end-to-end on a lot of these things. They're maybe terminated internally, right? There's some things that they're claiming are happening doesn't actually enforce end-to-end encryption and video conferencing. So it's an interesting concept here as to how secure are you really, and really, you would treat Zoom like you would treat anything else, email, something like that. You don't really have a right to a lot of privacy when you're using a third-party app. There are other things that you could leverage if you want to be completely secure, but it's good to understand what you can see and what is actually happening on the wire. Things like your ISP, people in between, they can't see that, and I'm going to show you that in ExtraHop. Now, if they're terminating the connection at Zoom headquarters, they may be able to decrypt that and be able to do something with that data, right? And there's a whole thing on China in here, which is kind of interesting, right? So there's some variables there. Everyone thinks of security, and there's different levels and layers to how you can implement that, especially with encryption. And then there's some other things in this blog that talk about privilege escalation and some things that have been exposed that Zoom's actually working very hard on to get fixed, which is cool, right? And there's a thing with China in here that they have some researchers in China, which is always makes people hesitate a little bit, right? And here it talks about the 128-bit and 256-bit AES keys that they're using. But they do some interesting things under the hood that on the wire that I want to show you. For further reading, on the New York Times, there's some Zoom bombing, essentially. So people are getting your links, and then they start to access it and troll your account, right? You can go out to Zoom and learn a little bit more about what that is and how to prevent that, right? But I'll just show you real quickly. Some of the things you can do is don't use your personal meeting ID. And then if you want to be able to do a waiting room, you can as well, and then enforce passwords. And so let me just kind of give you just a brief look at that if you don't know about it, which I'm sure a lot of you guys already do. But if I go here to schedule a meeting here, I can go here and it's scheduled, and I've got advanced options is what I want to pull down. You can enable a waiting room, and then you can want to make sure that you're using the password, and don't use your personal meeting ID. With the personal meeting ID, basically if I have that link, I can join and use that and abuse that at other times, especially if it doesn't have a password. So it's just something to keep in mind. Is a balance there, of course, but the best habit is essentially use a meeting password and generate a unique ID for each meeting you do. That'll save you most of the trouble that we're talking about and you're seeing out there in the wild with Zoom bombing. Okay, great. So that's all stuff that I'll kind of post in the YouTube video or the YouTube links as well, so you guys have access to it. But what can you see from ExtraHop's perspective? It's kind of interesting. So I've done Zoom just like everyone else is a lot this week, and you can see that there's my information going out to Zoom. And what's interesting is there's this UDP 8801 and SSL that goes out to Zoom. So I was looking into that a little bit, and I was like, all right, okay, so how do we dig into that? So they're doing some SSL, and they're doing UDP 8801, which is strange. It's not a normal behavior, and you can see here's the Zoom IP that it's going out to connect to. I was looking at their records on that, and you can see they're using elliptical curve Diffie-Hellman key with 128-bit encryption, the SHA-256 signing, TLS1 too. So it's reasonably good security, right? That'd be pretty hard you'd have to throw a lot of compute to be able to break that. Could it be better? Sure. I mean, anything could be, right? It's always a balance, essentially, right? You can see the certificate authority here, the host SNI, so you can validate all the things that are happening when it's expired, with ExtraHop, with that SSL transaction. But what's interesting to me, when I went to download the actual packets, and so they're doing this SSL certificate key, but I went to download the actual packets, you can see here, we go out and we say, here's my laptop, and it's going out to a Zoom IP address, and it comes back, and it's doing the TLS1-2 handshake, which we saw in ExtraHop. Great, we see the encryption, we see what's happening, but then it goes and does this UDP 8801 thing, which is interesting. And again, I haven't done a ton of research on this, but the reality is that's an interesting way to implement this, right? So whenever you see, it's a good way to identify Zoom on your network. And we actually have a VPN dashboard on the forums, which is going to go live to the full site at ExtraHop this week that you can download, that it actually looks for UDP 8801. So when you see that, you're going to see Zoom. But then if you try to follow this, and this is where that encryption, when I was talking about with that blog, this is where that encryption comes in. You see the encryption on the front for SSL handshake, and then they're using UDP 8801, and I think they're stuffing some level of encryption inside this UDP tunnel. Because even if you got a hold of this, the point is that you probably wouldn't be able to make heads or tails of it. Right, now if you're terminating it and you're doing some kind of decryption, of course, right, if you're the TCP proxy. For the majority of us, we don't have to worry about it. If you're working at top secret security or other things, you probably aren't going to use Zoom. Like, you probably shouldn't have from the very beginning. But the best thing for you to do day to day is prevent Zoom bombing by doing the tips of not using your personal meeting identifier meeting room, do a password, and do a waiting room so that you can check people in as the host. And then in ExtraHop, we have the ability to watch how much bandwidth Zoom is taking up by looking at things like what IPs are used and looking at UDP 8801, which is the majority of their multimedia traffic moving back and forth. Cool, guys. Thanks. Appreciate your time.